Yeah, this is obviously interesting just because, he's the former president's son, right? Proximity to the former president. And they're asking him, of course, about what was happening as the riot unfolded on January 6th. And they're reading back to him text messages he exchanged with Mark Meadows. At one point, Don Jr. tells Mark Meadows, the former president, Donald Trump, his dad, has got to condemn this. And then he says an expletive. So the committee is asking him, you said he's got to condemn it. What are you talking about? What did he have to condemn? And again, Don Jr. says the violence that's going on. Again, I think I made it pretty clear in my speech, we can do this peacefully, use your First Amendment rights, do it that way. But, violence has no place in this situation. And Abby, of course, we know from our previous reporting on the Mark Meadows text how Meadows and others at the White House were just getting inundated from people, including the former president's kids, trying to get Donald Trump to call off the masses. And in this transcript, Donald Trump Jr. points out that he was often in contact with other White House aides. He said when he tried to reach his dad at the White House, he would often get him through the White House operator because famously his father doesn't text, his father doesn't use emails. This is something that has stymied a number of investigators who have looked into Donald Trump, his sort of lack of a paper trail, and you get some more insight into these transcripts. They also asked Donald Trump Jr. a lot about the fundraising efforts around the election. We saw the committee make a lot of how much money Donald Trump raised on these baseless claims of election fraud. And Donald Trump Jr. sort of says, you could send out things under my name as long as they were approved by legal. That was sort of the tacit agreement. He says he would occasionally be in touch with big dollar donors, but said dialing for donors was his idea of hell. Abby.
Yeah, a lot of interesting things, a lot of I don't knows and I don't recalls in these transcripts as well. Sarah Murray, thank you. Let's discuss now with former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti and CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein. So Renato, obviously in these transcripts, you're seeing an effort, especially as we get closer into Trump's inner circle, to really try to not say definitively whether or not a lot of things happen. But one thing that has kind of struck out in many of the transcripts is the role of Mark Meadows, who was the chief of staff at the time. He was at the heart of a lot of this because he was the person physically closest to the president. We also learned yesterday Cassidy Hutchinson saw him throwing papers into a fireplace and burning them. From your perspective, what's next here for Mark Meadows? If you're the special counsel looking into all of this, is there more that you want to learn from him, and will they be able to get those answers?
It's a great question. I think that the challenge for Jack Smith is going to be the Fifth Amendment. If I was representing Mark Meadows, I would counsel him to take the Fifth and not testify whatsoever unless he received immunity. I think that, the question is really going to be for Jack Smith. Does he have enough evidence to go to Meadows' defense counsel, who's a very, very fine criminal defense attorney, and say, I'm going to indict your client if he does not cooperate? I think that's really the question here. Otherwise, the alternative would be to immunize Meadows in order to get his testimony against Trump, which is dangerous because Meadows may try to cover for Trump. I will say, by the way, that I think it is apparent, you're absolutely right, Abby, from reading these transcripts, how much Meadows was a key here. He was in many ways a funnel or a bottleneck for so many people trying to reach Trump that day.
And Ron, I want to just stay on Don Jr. for a second and this issue of how he was able to or not able to get to his father. In these transcripts, it makes it very clear that Don Jr. Thought it was imperative for his father to go to the Oval Office and say something, to do something. But he couldn't get through to Trump himself. What do you make of that? Just the fact that even for the former president's family, they weren't able to get this message through to him at such a critical moment.
Well, to Renato's first point, it is about the centrality of the role of Mark Meadows and how he was really the hub, I think, or the funnel for so much of this, including the efforts to communicate with him, the president, on that day. Can I focus, Abby, though, on another, just following up on another aspect of the Trump Jr. Deposition that I think is really critical? Because as you note, I don't know, I don't recall, I don't remember. If you take those words out, you might reduce it from 105 pages to 5. But there is one critical thing. There is one critical thing that he acknowledges. And, in the report, the first mention of the idea of having Republican-controlled state legislators throw out the vote in their state and simply substitute Donald Trump electors is from Donald Trump Jr. to Mark Meadows 2 days after the election. It's somewhere around page 260 of the report. And in this deposition, he's asked, where did he get that idea? And he acknowledges that it was, quote, a cut and paste from someone else, that he did not develop this himself. But he says, I don't remember who gave me the idea initially. I'm guessing that as they investigate the fake elector scheme and the broader conspiracy to obstruct the official proceeding, that is something that the special counsel is going to want to press Donald Trump Jr. on, rather than just simply, I don't remember. He is saying that idea, which I think is the first time it appears in the record of that suggestion, and Meadows responds, we are already working on it. So I think this is important insight into the genesis of the fake elector scheme.
Renato, I wonder what you make of that, and also this tactic that you see repeatedly in these transcripts from Don Jr., from others, Kimberly Guilfoyle, close to the former president, to try to suggest that they just don't remember things that are there. How far does that go when you're not a January 6th committee, but you're a federal investigator probing some of these questions?
Well, it's not uncommon, Abby, for witnesses to take that approach when there's a criminal investigation, because it can be hard to disprove what you can or can't remember. And so it's hard to charge someone with lying for saying that they don't recall or they don't remember something. So that's why they're doing it. I think one thing that struck me with Don Jr. is he sometimes takes it a step further and he tries to distance himself from his father, which I thought was very interesting. You know, he couldn't reach his father directly. That's why he went to Meadows. He's not really involved. As you mentioned a moment ago, he's just a fundraising guy. Like he makes himself seem like he's really very distant. Whereas in other media, at other times, if you read his Twitter feed or if you're getting his fundraising emails, which occasionally I do, he sounds like he's hand in glove with Donald Trump, his father, like they're, talking constantly and working together, and he's the heir apparent. So, I think it's interesting. It's really interesting when you compare it to some of the approach that other witnesses took, like Stephen Miller, who kept putting his arms around Donald Trump and was saying how glorious he was and really stuck with the party line. I think it shows that John Jr. really saw some potential culpability for himself here.
And Ron, speaking of Stephen Miller, there was another key quote in Miller's deposition. He was asked about this ellipse speech that happened on January 6th, and Miller told the investigators on the committee that it is a, quote, radical impossibility and extreme and outlandish to say that Trump wanted anything but, quote, peace and harmony on January 6th. Just your reaction on its face to that statement from Stephen Miller.
Well, look, Stephen Miller is the purified essence of Trumpism, embodied in an individual. We continue to see it in the causes that he has pushed, the group that he was associated with that had those openly racist ads during the baseball playoffs about the border and so forth. And look, it's just a reminder that there is a substantial portion of the Republican Party still that is going to defend Donald Trump to the last yard, even after the evidence, as we've talked about before, about what happened in this election in swing states to candidates who are essentially running under his umbrella. I looked at Stephen Miller's deposition just as an indication of how hard it is going to be from the Republican Party to simply put Donald Trump in the rearview mirror, no matter how many fundraisers and other party strategists want to do so. There is a core that is deeply invested in his polarizing and divisive brand of politics, and Miller is a reflection of that.
Renato, one of the new pieces of information that we're getting is from actually the transcript of Christina Bobb, a Trump lawyer who's relaying to the committee in her testimony some conversations that she had with Senator Lindsey Graham, who, as you know, is a close ally of former President Trump's. And this seems to kind of speak to a desire on the part of so many people around Trump to find fraud where there was none. Christina Bobb says that Lindsey Graham tells her to just give me 5 dead voters. Give me. That Graham told Meadows this, but she told the committee, give me 5 dead voters. Find an example of illegals voting. Give me a small snapshot, he says, of anything that he can take and champion in order to demonstrate evidence of fraud. And as we know, there was no evidence of fraud. But what does it tell you that someone like a sitting Senator Lindsey Graham was basically begging for examples of anything that would prove these baseless claims that the election was stolen?
Yeah, it certainly makes it look like, which was something I think we already knew, is that he was on Team Trump and was willing to do what he could to try to help Trump create enough of a circus around the electoral results to try to overturn the results of the election. And so one thing that I find interesting, just looking at this from as a former prosecutor and a current defense attorney, is how does this line up with what he told the Fulton County prosecutor? You know, there he's on the, you know, supposedly he's having phone calls to Georgia, trying to influence things over there, and he's probably trying to take the tack that Don Jr. was, right? You know, I don't remember much. I'm super away from this. I wasn't really hands-on. And what does Bob make him look like? The exact opposite. Very eager to get involved against dirty on behalf of Donald Trump.